Hi, everyone. Welcome to CSR Talent Group's Corporate Impact Leaders podcast. We are pleased today to have with us Susanne Salerno. She is the president of Salerno Consulting, a chartered advisor in philanthropy, a donor advised fund professional, and an adjunct instructor at the American College. And Suzanne and I have known each other for a little while. She's one of our first affiliates in CSR Talent Group when we first started about 5 years ago. So, welcome, Suzanne. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to talk today about donor advised funds. But before we do that, I was hoping that Suzanne could provide a little bit more about her background and her work, and then we'll get right into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's great to be here with you today to talk about a favorite subject, donor advised funds and CSR. In my business, I'm a strategist and a philanthropic advisor, and I work cross sectors with nonprofits, companies, and intermediaries as a thought partner, as an advisor, and as an implementer of the programs that we're creating together, all with the kind of goal to how do we get more capital to solve on these social issues and have impact. So I've been doing this for about 5 years as a consultant in my business. And prior to that, I worked across sector, spent a lot of time in the public media space, subject for another day, and also my first role was at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And I really got into this work nearly 30 years ago.
Fantastic. So, a pretty broad experience in social impact, both with companies and nonprofits. Before I get into the questions, actually tell me a little bit more about your experience with donor advised funds and how you came to become an expert in that.
Sure. So I first learned about donor advised funds back around 2005. And then took a role at Fidelity Charitable, so one of the big national sponsoring organizations through Fidelity Investments. So that is where I really, learned, took a deep dive on donor advised funds. How do they work? I had been working on the nonprofit side in the fundraising and development team, thinking about how do we secure kind of donations from individuals, companies, organizations. And back in 2006, 7 and 8, when I was at Fidelity Charitable, that was, the earlier stages of the donor advised fund space. It has since kind of just boomed and grown so much since that time. Then over time, how I've interacted with donor advised funds, for example, I recently just you mentioned the donor advised fund professional. I've held the chartered advisor in philanthropy designation since 2007. But the American College is establishing a new certificate program on donor advised funds. So I was in the first class of that cohort earlier this year. And I also have worked with corporate clients on thinking through, is there a role for a donor advised fund versus a foundation, which I know we're going to get into, in managing our philanthropy as a company.
Well, that's great. That sounds like really interesting background. I appreciate that context. So let's get into it. For those who don't really know what a donor advised fund is, can you explain exactly what it is?
Sure. So the donor advised fund is going to be it's a charitable giving vehicle, and it's managed by a public charity, often called the sponsoring organization. And it allows the individual to contribute with a variety of assets that can be stock donations, cash, other closely held type of securities. You're going to receive that tax deduction when you make the donation into your donor advised fund. And then you have the opportunity to recommend grants to qualified charities over time. So that donor advised fund account kind of functions as a charitable investment account or a checking account where you're able to make donations anytime into your DAF account. The sponsoring organization is managing those assets for you. They can grow over time. They also have the legal control of those assets. And then you become the advisor over that account, whether it's you as an individual, a family, or a company. And you decide how and when you want to recommend grants to support nonprofits that you're passionate about. The donor advised funds have been around for nearly a century, and they were first established at community foundations. The New York Community Trust was actually the first to hold a donor advised fund account. But today they exist kind of across a range of different types of organizations. And even universities might have their own donor advised fund within kind of their structure as well. When you think of a big university, they're managing assets from small to very large.
Interesting. So in addition to the community foundations, and it sounds like universities, some of them might have that option. What other players or organizations are out there that can facilitate this?
Yes. So what's been happening then in more recent years, I'd say in the last decade, you're seeing a lot of technology-focused companies who are, their first goal is establishing something that helps CSR leaders, like the individuals who are tuning in to your podcast, to manage their CSR programs. But what they realized is that the donor advised fund can be a helpful tool to sit alongside the technology to manage, whether it be the corporate philanthropy, creating a corporate account for philanthropy that is different than a corporate foundation, and also to manage individual accounts for your employees, for example. So those are some of the different things that are happening with the DAF case. So what would happen is the corporate entity, and in fact, one of your partners, Gavinga, sits in this space. So Gavinga itself is the for-profit entity. They have established the technology and the mission and purpose for how do we help kind of companies and move philanthropy in this space. But they also have the Gavinga Foundation, which they had to create in order to manage the donations into an account and then manage the grants out of an account. So you have to have an established, the tech designation by the IRS is a 501c3 in order for individuals or companies to get that tax benefit and to be holding assets in the public trust.
Interesting.
Yep.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons, because as you and I know, corporate foundations have been around for a long time and they're evolving pretty rapidly recently, especially with the need to align with what the company's doing around business interests and ESG pressure and all of that. So from your perspective, and I know this may depend on the size of the company, the type of the company, but broadly speaking, what do you see as the pros and cons of a DAF versus a foundation, corporate foundation?
Sure. Each has benefits. And I think the most important thing in this space is that, I love seeing companies doing this work and having a commitment to giving back. So in philanthropy and designated assets and capital to be a good corporate citizen. The corporate foundation can be a great tool. It's a standalone kind of entity that does require staff. It requires some time commitment. You would have to go through the IRS and establish your corporate foundation, setting up those logistics. Often you'll want legal counsel when you're establishing the corporate foundation. And there needs to be staff on an ongoing basis who are then going to manage the annual tax filings, all of the grants, the investment account. A lot of different administrative pieces go into that corporate foundation, all manageable. And, but the company needs to kind of determine who is that team that's going to manage that and kind of be part of the corporate foundation. You also have to then have a board of trustees or board of directors who are overseeing and named as having the governance over that corporate foundation. On the donor advised fund side, the difference is you can establish a donor advised fund account relatively quickly. So you would identify who is the right sponsoring entity or organization. If you're kind of in the CSR space, it might be the same partner that you're thinking of to manage technology, to manage many of the aspects of your CSR work. So it can be established quickly. You can do many of the same functions, make donations into the account at any time. It's managed as an investment and can grow over time. And then somebody on your team is the designated account holder and makes the grant recommendations on the company's behalf. I would say one key difference that's really important for the companies to understand is that once you've opened a donor advised fund account, the assets are now technically, owned by the sponsoring organization, or held by the sponsoring organization, I should say. You as a company then have advisory access to recommend grants, but it's the donor advised fund sponsoring entity who ultimately says we'll approve your grant to a nonprofit. Whereas on a foundation side, there's a little bit more control still established with the company.
So I'm hearing a couple of things. One is sort of logistics and expense, and I don't want to get into that a little bit. The expense of having a staff versus I guess the fees that you would pay to the sponsoring organization. Two is the control, and I wanted to ask you about control around investments too. But then there's also the control around being able to make the choice around the grants. So maybe touch on a couple of those. Let's start with the expenses. Obviously, for some companies, it's going to be a little bit of a no-brainer. They just don't want to build the staff and go through the logistics and the headaches of doing everything you need to do to get that foundation in place. But do you have a sense of what the fees are from the sponsoring organizations? And I imagine those vary, obviously, depending on size and
Yeah, they vary depending on size,
yeah,
depending on how you might establish it. So there is a range of
yeah,
fees, and that's one of the things that's also changing. You're seeing more and more entries that might have a different set of fees. The fees, though, if you're moving towards the DAF space, you're likely partnering with that technology or that company that kind of is managing the DAF accounts,
mhm,
because you're purchasing the technology that you're also using. So the fees are coming in more in that sense
right,
of it's a tool that you've decided as a company to use. But on the benefit side there, since we're kind of touching on that, more and more of these companies are creating technology that it serves all of the purposes you might need as a CSR leader. So even going back a number of years, you might need a different technology to manage the foundation versus managing grant applications coming in. If you kind of have a opportunity for nonprofits to submit an application to manage volunteerism, now you might be partnering with one of these companies and they're able to do all of these things within kind of one platform.
yeah. And so you would mention community foundations, for example. I guess that's like New York Community Trust and other. Are
Exactly.
those maybe a little bit out of favor for companies because these technology solutions tackle so many other things? Um,
Not necessarily. I mean, they
yeah,
can be a really good partner as well,
yeah,
especially if you're very centrally kind of focused on the community where your headquarters is,
right.
and you might not have as many. Maybe you don't have as many locations across the country or globally.
Yep.
That can be a really good partner, because the community foundation often tends to also have individual staff who can also help think through who's the right nonprofit partner for
Right.
the issues that you're trying to solve.
Good point.
Whereas at the national sponsor level, like those associated with financial services firms, they're a little more agnostic. They don't necessarily have kind of that that guidance on individual nonprofits and ways to kind of solve.
That's interesting. And I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but would companies sometimes have a donor advised fund with a community foundation for their headquarters or where they've got the most employees, and then maybe also have technology solution for their global or national programs? Have you ever
Yep.
seen that?
And yes, that's absolutely a possibility. And another reason they might do that is because they may be a funder of the community foundation because they recognize that that community foundation is an important entity in their community. So you can, at a community foundation, the slight difference is you can both establish a donor individual family or corporate donor advised fund,
Mhm.
but they also accept kind of annual funds where the community foundation is then making grants
Right.
as the community foundation, and your company might become a supporter of the community foundation. So different ways to interact with all of these different entities.
Let's talk about the control issue briefly. And by control, I mean, I mentioned both on making decisions on the assets and where they're invested, as well as the control over the decision making for the grants themselves. How does that vary by community foundations or other DAFs or technology solutions?
Yeah, so why don't we start too with the corporate foundation versus the DAF. So at the
Yeah.
corporate foundation, in both cases, you've moved money and you've received a charitable benefit. So the money then has to be used for grant making or funding nonprofits. It's in the public trust. But
Mhm.
the corporate foundation that the company might establish, they have, oftentimes it'll be their company members who are staff members who are the board members of the corporate foundation. So they have that kind of control over the endowed corporate foundation account.
Yeah.
And they can make the decisions on the investments
Okay.
there. Whereas in the DAF account, there are also investment options that the DAF sponsor has created. So you could also be deciding on where do I want those assets to be invested while they're sitting there, and I'm in the hopes of growing. So somebody on the team would still need to kind of be thinking through that role. So those are the kind of the differences, though, in the place that the DAF, though, now it's under the control of the DAF itself to ultimately say, yes, Tom, we agree to that you can make this grant to this nonprofit.
Okay.
And really what that's boiling down to, though, is making sure that the charity that you are saying I want to make a grant to is still in good standing with
Right.
the IRS.
Got it.
They haven't done something wrong, and therefore the assets might not be used for the right charitable purposes.
Right. So that's actually helpful for them to assess that
Yep.
for the company.
Yep. Yep.
Um, I want to ask you sort of a multiple question here. Um, would love for you to talk a little bit about the logistics for a company to engage with a DAF. How do corporate programs go about it? What are some steps they need to take, and what's that process? And if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways you've worked with DAF programs for companies,
Sure.
and you can hit that either way, whatever works.
Either. Yeah. Well, one of the areas we haven't touched on that kind of then the company, how they might engage with the DAF that is different than a corporate foundation, is the company can also then create both their, and you can call it a foundation at either place, it can still be called the Smith Foundation, or whatever the company's name is, foundation, even at the donor advised fund. So externally, you can still talk about it in that capacity. But they can also establish individual accounts for your employees at that same DAF sponsor. So this is a rising kind of benefit for employees. It kind of mirrors what, when I started working way back when, it was, you could kind of make gifts through the United Way campaign at your company. Now, companies are thinking about when an employee signs up and says, and you've got the job. But some companies are creating a donor advised fund account right there as a launching you into your career at this company with a donor advised fund. You're an individual account.
Oh,
So that becomes the employee benefit. And then each year, the company might move money into that each individual's donor advised fund account on their employee roster. So that's a huge kind of growing space of how the DAFs are kind of interacting with companies.
you mean the companies make the donation for the employee, but the employee makes the decision as to where the money goes.
Yep.
But the
Yep.
employee can also donate their own money into that DAF?
Yes. And this is also where kind of the matching gifts, the traditional kind of matching gift funds can be now kind of managed through a donor advised fund type structure as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yep.
So just to be clear, these companies they're not doing some of them are not just doing a matching gift. They are putting money into an employee's account as a benefit to say, look, we've put this money into your DAF account, and spend it whatever way you want to, meaning there's no guidance or control by the company on where the individual can spend that money.
Depends on the company. Many companies do have kind of a structure of the types of, or if they want it to align with kind of their mission of giving back. But with these technology partners, that can be established too in kind of the back end technology to say, okay, here are the types of nonprofits that our employees are able to recommend grants to.
Yeah.
So that can be kind of structured in that way for the company.
That's so interesting.
Yep.
Are there any sort of technical issues that companies should know about? So if I'm a company and I'm thinking about identifying a DAF, either locally or nationally, um, what should I know as far as the amount of time it would take, the due diligence I need to do, the process itself? Is that complicated or is that pretty straightforward?
What you typically do is, and what I've done with a corporate client is then once you've made this decision to think about, okay, I have a need, I'm trying to solve for something. It's kind of going out for an RFP, meeting with a number of these types of providers, and having them do their kind of traditional kind of, here's how it works, here's how our product works, the traditional pitch, and then think through which one of these is best aligned with what we're trying to do as a company. The newer players that we've mentioned, for instance, kind of like a Groundswell or a Gavinga, there's a lot of different options that their technology is able to do, check off many of these boxes that we're thinking about.
And that's where you can come in, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah.
Given your background and experience, you could go into a company and help them, first of all, understand the landscape, who's out there, and then help them assess who might be a good fit after you work with them to really understand what their goals are and what they're trying to accomplish.
That's right. Yep. And in fact, for one example, with my colleague Kristen, we worked with a company who were at that exact phase. So the company was interested in establishing its first ever foundation. At the time that we kind of connected with them, they were managing gifts through kind of a spreadsheet in human resources. And they were interested in establishing something. So the first phase of that work was really guiding the executives. This was a global publicly traded company on, actually there's a couple of options. What is a corporate foundation versus what is a donor advised fund? Really walking them through and making sure everyone understood, especially those nuances in control that we were talking about earlier, of understanding if you go donor advised fund, the key piece you need to all raise your hands and say we've heard you, is that there's a different type of control then over those assets. You can't then turn around and decide on a different structure. Once you've moved the assets into the donor advised fund, they're there. And then from there, we kind of walked them through, okay, you got comfortable saying we think we want to go DAF. Let's go out, and we identified about 8 to 10 different options, including the local community foundation, and had them come back and do pitches and kind of provide the guidance on what would this partnership look like? What are the costs? What do we offer? And then make a decision from there.
That's fascinating. That sounds like a really helpful service. And especially if for those new companies that are trying to find their way between a foundation and a DAF, I'm curious about a company has a corporate foundation, may not be pleased with it. Do you see companies either switching or moving money over to a DAF while they sort of slow down on the foundation side, or is that not a reality?
No, it is. And in fact, that was one of the things we talked about as well, that the speed to creating DAF account in this client's case, for instance, was a benefit because they were trying to do something within that tax year. And they wanted to open the account within that calendar year. So the DAF also was a favorable option because they didn't have to go through those other steps with the establishing a 501c3. What I talked about with them is, this could be, once you move this money this year, it will sit in the DAF. That's where you'll grant from.
Yep.
You could also down the road decide, okay, we have this DAF, but we also are comfortable with the corporate foundation structure and create that with, maybe there's another high earnings year and they're moving more money into philanthropy. So you could have both.
Right. So you're not limited when you make a decision to go one way or the other.
No, the limitations are, though, it has to, once you've moved it to the one place, that's where you have to know over time, we're going to be using that account to make grants from it, whether we add to it or totally wind it down within a couple of years.
Makes sense.
Yep.
So it sounds like one of the big changes in DAFs over the last decade is technology. These technology companies taking on this role and connecting it to other work that CSR professionals need to handle at the same time, or is that what else has happened over the last decade?
That's certainly one of the key areas I've seen growing is how can that same partner that historically might have been a partner to manage volunteer hours, or you always needed technology to do some of these things.
Yeah.
And now they're really a thought partner in kind of all of these steps that can help a CSR leader. And, I know you talk about this regularly, the CSR teams still today, even at big companies, are small. So you've got a relatively small team managing a lot of different aspects on behalf of the company. And these tools and partners can be very helpful in making this work kind of flow all together.
Yeah, that's a great final thought to end on. We've just scratched the surface here, and I think we could talk about this for another hour, but any final thoughts, anything that we haven't touched on that you think would be helpful for companies to know? And I will just make a pitch for you here, for those companies that are interested in this subject and wondering about next steps. Feel free to connect with Susanne either directly or through us. And I'll let you give your contact information at the end. But any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yeah, we didn't touch on the size of the DAF space right now.
Yeah.
So as of 2023, there was upwards of 251 billion with a B dollars now in DAFs. But the other thing to know, and this is comes one of the national sponsoring organizations is National Philanthropic Trust. They do an annual report on the state of DAFs. And so this data, it's the 2024 report, which is looking at 2023 numbers. But DAFs, on average, are granting out nearly 24%. So that means, yes, there's $250 billion in there, but they are granting out and moving money back out at a higher rate than the IRS required amount for corporate foundations or any foundation, which is 5%.
Interesting.
Yes. So that's some important pieces, but also, and then the number of accounts is growing because what's changed with these newer players in the space as well is you can establish an account at a much lower level. A $50 account could be established for an employee. So you've got thousands more donor advised fund accounts there. When I first started in the space, it was much more of a tool for kind of the high net worth space because the minimums to establish were kind of in the $5,000 or more range. And the grant back out amounts were much higher. So you couldn't necessarily use it to manage if you wanted to make $50 donations to some organization. So that's where there's a lot of change as well as just it's democratized philanthropy in this space through DAFs.
That's fantastic. So you're saying the growth is partly because of that democratization and technology, and maybe also the companies looking for new ways to really engage and support their employees, because that seems to be growing rapidly, especially these days when there's there's always a need to engage employees, but it just seems like there's a lot of disaffected employees in companies.
Right.
So this is one way to really pull them in, it sounds like.
It's a way to pull them in, and it helps also as I know we're shifting back, but especially with more virtual, it's a way to kind of have this connectivity perhaps across giving and across both the company's nonprofit partners, but also what are your employees thinking about as their passion areas for charitable work.
Fantastic. Well, Susanne, thank you. I certainly learned a lot during this discussion, and I hope everybody listening is learning as well. Why don't you give us your contact info if people want to reach out to you?
Sure. So you can reach me. I'm regularly on LinkedIn, so you can find me at Susanne Salerno, but also it's a tough one, but my first initial, so S Salerno at SESalernoconsulting.com.
Okay. And you can always reach Susanne through us. We will help you make that connection. Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And we will come back to this subject again at some point later. But for now, I think we're good. So really appreciate your time and energy, and this discussion was fantastic.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the opportunity to bring DAFs to this your talent community.
Not at all. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us today. And please do let us know if you have any questions or if we can help you connect with Susanne. Take care.